The connection between Martin Luther and Nazi ideology is a subject of significant scholarly debate. While Luther lived 4 centuries before the rise of Adolf Hitler, Nazi leaders and propagandists selectively used his writings, especially his harsh statements against Jews, to legitimize their anti-Semitic worldview. Historians agree that Luther did not advocate racial genocide or nationalism as understood in modern terms. Nevertheless, certain late-life writings by Luther provided language the Nazi regime manipulated for its own purposes. Understanding this connection requires examining Luther's original context, the nature of his anti-Semitic writings, and the ways Nazi Germany used those writings for ideological and propagandistic ends. Martin Luther's early writings expressed hope for the conversion of Jewish people, but his later works became sharply hostile when conversion did not occur. His 1543 treatises, On the Jews and Their Lies, and On the Ineffable Name, included severe recommendations such as destroying synagogues, confiscating Jewish books, and restricting rabbinic teaching. These writings were grounded in theological arguments typical of medieval anti-Judaism, not racial theories. Luther opposed Jews for rejecting the gospel, not for biological reasons. Nevertheless, his language was extreme, harsh, and morally troubling, setting a dangerous precedent centuries later. Historians emphasize that Luther's antisemitism was religious and theological, not racial. Nazi antisemitism, by contrast, was biological, racial, and genocidal. Nazi leaders saw Luther as a culturally German figure whose authority could bolster their ideology. They selectively quoted him to provide historical legitimacy for their anti-Semitic policies. For example, in 1933, during the 450th anniversary of Luther's birth, Nazi propagandists celebrated him as a German hero who resisted Jewish influence. Luther's anti-Jewish writings were reprinted and distributed widely by Nazi supporters, including the anti-Jewish propaganda journal Der Stürmer. Joseph Goebbels referred to Luther as one of the greatest Germans, suggesting that Nazi policy followed Luther's warnings about Jews. Although the Nazis invoked Luther, most mainstream Lutheran theologians strongly opposed the Nazi distortion of his teachings. A nationalist, pro-Nazi Protestant group known as the German Christians used Luther's writings to create a racially purified German Christianity. They argued that Luther paved the way for a de-Jewish Christianity. That Jesus was an Aryan figure, not a Jew. That the Church should support the Führerprinzip, leader principle. These claims contradicted both Scripture and Orthodox Christian doctrine. Still, the group's misuse of Luther exemplified how his legacy became entangled with Nazi ideology. Historians emphasize that Nazi use of Luther involved distortion, selective quotation, and anachronism. Key misuses included 1. Racializing Luther's religious language. Luther's arguments were theological, Nazis transformed them into racial ideology. 2. Ignoring Luther's positive teachings. Nazis excluded Luther's insistence on the value of every human being before God and his doctrine of Christian love. 3. Portraying Luther as a proto-nationalist. Luther opposed violent rebellion and nationalism, yet Nazis cast him as a precursor to German racial destiny. 4. Exploiting his authority for state control. Hitler and Goebbels cited Luther to imply that anti-Semitic policies were consistent with Christian tradition. Many Lutheran theologians in the Confessing Church, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, condemned Nazi anti-Semitism as unchristian and rejected attempts to invoke Luther for political purposes. Scholars generally agree on the following points. Luther's late writings contain harsh and regrettable attacks on Jews. These writings made it easier for Nazis to draw on historical Christian anti-Semitism. However, Luther's theology did not advocate racial violence, genocide, or the biological racism central to Nazism. The Nazi regime used Luther selectively and manipulatively to justify policies he never envisioned. In short, Luther was not a Nazi precursor, but his writings, especially on the Jews and their lies, provided historical material that Nazi propagandists exploited. Martin Luther's work became connected to Nazi ideology not because he contributed to modern racial anti-Semitism, but because Nazi leaders deliberately misused his writings for political and ideological purposes. His late-life anti-Jewish statements, though theological in nature, were extreme enough for Nazis to weaponize them. Understanding this history requires both acknowledging the troubling aspects of Luther's legacy and recognizing the fundamental differences between his theology and the racial genocide of the 20th century. Ultimately, the Nazi appropriation of Luther demonstrates how historical figures can be distorted for destructive ends when viewed through the lens of propaganda and nationalism.